It's the boomer erasure of Gen X in action. Watch your photo fade into nothingness on NES Works episode 155. I've been covering a lot of NES games based on licenses for baby boomer era media properties lately. So the prospect of a game based on a brand new, fresh film franchise for the latter 80s seems exciting. But it's Back to the Future for NES, a game whose story and theme embodies this entire trend of NES software. Back to the Future tells the story of a Generation X kid trapped in a boomer world. That's pretty much the entire NES experience for 1989 in a nutshell, as we've seen over the past half dozen episodes or so. But before we go on, maybe it would be worth my actually explaining what all of this generation warfare is all about. If you are a tiny little sproutling of an audience member who did not even exist in the 20th century, and my YouTube metrics tell me that there are 2 or 3 of you out there, you've certainly heard the expression boomer, but may not be fully conversant in the true meaning of the word. It's not just an expression of contempt for old people. I mean, it is, but the origin of the word ties back to the cultural evolution of the latter 20th century, the petri dish of creative and technological innovation that birthed video games in the first place. Boomers aren't just Cylons and off-brand replicants. The full term is baby boomer, referring to the generation of American children born in the wake of World War II after the greatest generation returned from deployment and celebrated their homecoming by having, by all accounts, record-breaking volumes of sex. Babies ensued, thus the baby boom. The kids born after World War II in both the Americas and Europe found themselves living in a time of unprecedented peace, wealth, and advancement. All the inventive ways that science devised to kill large quantities of other people during the war trickled out to the general public in new, more benign forms, ranging from computers to transportation to novel ways to package food. Buoyed by things like incredibly low petroleum prices and loads of money being invested into technological development for consumer-oriented gadgets, the boomers' formative years coincided with what cultural anthropologists refer to as the long summer. Nearly 3 decades of growth and advancement around the world. It certainly wasn't a perfect time, but it really did seem like the world was collectively on an upward trend, which would never end. Which is why you could have utopian television shows like Star Trek and everyone would say, yes, this makes sense. In the early 1970s, however, just as the younger boomer generation entered adolescence and the older cohort began to consider their careers, the long summer ended. Things like the Vietnam War, the uncoupling of the dollar from the gold standard, and the OPEC oil crisis that sent petroleum costs skyrocketing delivered a succession of shocks to the US and global economy and to society as a whole. The long summer ended and recession set in. Things like gas, power, and meat, things that American took for granted in abundance for decades, suddenly became expensive or even inaccessible. Eventually things did normalize, but society never quite settled back into the comfortable groove of the boomers' childhoods. But what does this have to do with Back to the Future for NES, you ask? Well, everything, really. When the long summer ended, a collective sense of cynicism replaced the optimism of the American mindset. The nostalgia for better days became a commodity, mass-market good, for perhaps the first time in human history. I mean, who knows? Maybe the ancient Babylonians wrote long-lost best-selling cuneiform tablet novels about the good old days when copper merchants could be trusted to peddle high-quality wares, unlike the shady con artists who had cornered the modern market. But if you look at many of the biggest pop culture successes of the late 70s, they involve repackaging and lionizing those good old days. Which is to say the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, when the creators responsible for those works were children growing up. Which isn't to say that this new sense of cynicism didn't creep into some of those works. MASH, for example, may have been a sitcom about the hilarity of serving in a field hospital in a conflict that Congress never formally declared as a war, but it frequently faced the darkness of war, or not war, head-on. But then you have things like The Godfather, a tale about better times when mafia dons commanded respect, damn it, or Star Wars, a high-tech tribute to the corny sci-fi serials that George Lucas loved as a kid, or Happy Days, a small-town sitcom set in the 50s with a title that is so close to good old days that it might actually be legally actionable. This is not what Back to the Future the game is all about. However, Back to the Future the movie absolutely falls into this trend of works by adult boomers that look back to their 1950s childhood. But Back to the Future is not Happy Days. If anything, it feels like a story that attempts to challenge the rose-tinted glasses that characterize so many efforts to cash in on boomers' nostalgia for the 50s by presenting that old world through the eyes of a child of the 80s. Writer Bob Gale and director Robert Zemeckis deftly create parallels between the two decades, highlighting the charming parts of life in each era while also creating both dramatic tension and comedic frisson between their unsavory elements. Protagonist Marty McFly may live in a gloomy home with a family beaten down by economic recession and personal failings, but on the other hand, there's a lot less racism in 1980s Hill Valley, California. Well, nuclear terrorists aside. Back to the Future is one of those nearly perfect films from this era, with a tight screenplay that doesn't waste a single detail and an emphasis on exciting action and special effects that never strays into an over-reliance on those elements. A lot of its excellence comes from its casting, pairing together two television sitcom big shots. Christopher Lloyd of Taxi as unhinged scientific genius Doc Emmett Brown, and Michael J. Fox of Family Ties as fish-out-of-water 80s teen Marty McFly. It combines these two stars with a great group of supporting actors, including the excellent choice to have awkward weirdo George McFly portrayed by real-life awkward weirdo Crispin Glover. Fox turned out to be especially inspired casting, although he almost couldn't accommodate the filming schedule due to other commitments. Fortunately, he worked it out when his replacement Eric Stoltz gave off inappropriately bleak vibes in his performance. But not only does Fox fill his portrayal with a perfect combination of 80s teen cockiness and disbelieving panic at the outlandish crisis he finds himself in, there's also some interesting subtext to his presence that underscore the generational tension inherent in the movie's script. Fox had made his fame as Alex P. Keaton in the sitcom Family Ties, where he played a young Reagan-era Republican, a money-obsessed yuppie in the making who constantly butted heads with his leftist boomer parents. So seeing him as Marty, in a wildly different sort of conflict with boomer parents, gave the movie a nice touch of additional subtext. Where you see, Marty McFly has become unstuck in time, accidentally traveling backward due to a tragic event in which Doc Brown is gunned down in a parking lot by terrorists who sold him the plutonium that was supposed to have powered a nuclear weapon, but which Doc Brown instead used to power his experimental time machine, which he quite symbolically installed to one of the most outstanding icons of 80s excess imaginable, the DMC DeLorean, a stainless steel gull-wing sports car. Marty escapes into the past and immediately starts butterfly affecting the present of Hill Valley by killing pine trees and inspiring a janitor to become mayor. He also, quite unintentionally, triggers a grandfather paradox by preventing his loser pervert of a father from being killed by a car, and in the process, becoming the object of sexual obsession by a teenage girl he recognizes as his future mother. Well, you don't need me to summarize the film's plot for you. As I keep telling you people in the comments, this channel is not Wikipedia. But the short of it is that Back to the Future is simultaneously a great comedy that makes esoteric science fiction concepts palatable for a mass audience with simple stakes. If Marty doesn't find a way to get his horny teen mom interested in his gormless teen dad, he's going to fade from existence. And at the same time, it gently rebukes uncritical nostalgia for the 1950s by presenting that era through the eyes of a kid who had only heard good things about the past, yet quickly discovers that every generation has to wade through its own miseries. Marty learns, for example, that his uptight, moralistic mother was a boy-thirsty hypocrite, and that his teenage father was a starry-eyed, lecherous creative visionary rather than the beaten-down, middle-aged loser he knew at home. And he's forced to reconcile these two incompatible humans into a couple and harness science itself by doing a Connecticut Yankee and taking advantage of his foreknowledge of a once-in-a-lifetime lightning strike in order to get back home to the future, all while navigating the social mores and cultural politics of a very different yet curiously familiar era of time. It's a great movie that boomers and Xers alike could enjoy. Too bad I can't say the same for the game. Friends, I'm afraid that the salad days of publisher LJN are well and truly over. I mean, LJN never published anything great, but at least in the company's early days, they commissioned excellent Japanese studios to produce ambitious, if decidedly flawed, games based on movies. With a little more tweaking, LJN releases like Friday the 13th and Jaws could have been great. I don't think there's any way to redeem Back to the Future for NES, though. This is a pretty miserable game that borrows the visual signifiers of the movie in order to dress up some honestly miserable gameplay, and it does very little to give players an experience that uniquely capitalizes on the things that made the film so wonderful. Back to the Future comes to us from Australian developer Beam Software. If you're keeping count, this is something like the 4th time Beam has appeared on NES Works 1989, and I'm sorry to say that they're going to keep turning up, like malignant members of the Tannen clan. So far, we've seen 2 competent, if not exactly great, Beam-developed titles in Defender of the Crown and The Three Stooges. We've also seen the disastrous Airwolf, which was the NES equivalent of inviting a vampire into your home. Airwolf allowed Beam over the threshold, and there's no going back. I don't want to bag on Beam here, especially when there's a non-zero chance someone who used to work at the studio might see this video and decide to kick my ass at a retro gaming convention someday. Beam clearly had some capable programmers on staff. Their ports of CinemaWare's games were honestly about as good as anyone could possibly expect from literal NES adaptations of games designed for vastly more powerful machines. I just don't think Beam had a good handle on the kind of visual and gameplay design that fit the NES. Up until 1989, the overwhelming majority of NES games came from Japanese studios. While not always good, there have in fact been some sincerely wretched games to have plopped onto the NES from the foul bowels of bottom-tier Japanese developers. I do feel that games developed in Japan frequently operated from the same vocabulary of gameplay and graphical design. And that style generally speaks to me more than the games of European and Australian developers who tend to work with their own common shared vocabulary. The vocabulary used by Beam harkens back to habits and processes that evolved on the low-power, graphically deficient computers that dominated Europe and Australia. Yes, I'm looking at you, ZX Spectrum and BBC Micro. Weirdly enough, the most beloved Spectrum developer of all time, Rare Limited, was one of the few European developers to have largely set aside those patterns for their games, embracing a decidedly Japanese ethos in their work. That's probably because Rare's developers abandoned the Spectrum fairly early on, having realized there were no bits left to conquer. Whereas the likes of Beam, Ocean, and Gremlin Graphics spent a lot longer working in the 8-bit micro salt mines and came to NES fairly late. That leads us to games like Back to the Future, a disjointed collection of minigame events, none of which are fun. It's probably best to think of Back to the Future as an extremely limited vertical on-foot shooter along the lines of Commando or Frontline, where boss stages take the form of unique special events. I guess this isn't wildly different in structure from Kid Icarus, a ratchet scroll shooter whose boss stages take place in Zelda-style labyrinths. Except that I will happily play Kid Icarus, while I will happily defer to the angry video game nerds' views on Back to the Future.
There's no excuse.
The quote-unquote boss events in Back to the Future all represent film scenes to varying degrees. The first of these events takes place in the diner where Marty helps inspire future Mayor Goldie Wilson's political career. But it kind of plays like a sideways Space Invaders where you have to chuck what I guess are meant to be slices of pie at greaser thugs before they reach the counter where Marty apparently now works as a dessert sommelier. The second boss battle takes place in a Hill Valley High School classroom, which, fair, but it's sort of a reverse version of the first stage, in which Marty, now seemingly a teacher, has to use what I guess is Gray's sports almanac in order to block an incoming stream of heart icons from his mom. Sure, I guess. The third event sees Marty on the gym stage at the high school dance, raising and lowering his electric guitar in order to catch notes, while playing a probably not legally licensed rendition of Johnny Be Good in order to fill up the love meter on the side of the screen, which somehow makes his teenage parents want to bump uglies. And the final event sees you accelerating in the DeLorean as you cruise the road with the goal of reaching 88 miles per hour and maintaining that speed until you hit the wire spanning the road, whereupon
You're gonna see some serious shit.
But really, the majority of the game consists of street sequences, where Marty walks, runs, and, if you're lucky, makes like Master Takahashi and rides a skateboard toward the end of each level, dodging obstacles and angry hula hoopers while collecting clocks. The clocks are important not because they refill the stage timer that counts down in the corner of the screen. Oh no, there are 2 timers here, and the clock buffers the second and less intuitive of these, the photo at the bottom of the screen. Yes, the screen perimeter frame contains a barely legible rendition of the family photo that Marty uses in the movie as his personal talisman to judge the amount of time he has remaining to convince Lorraine to pursue George, rather than making weird wishes about her future sons, Calvin Klein's. If you don't collect clocks, this photo fades to nothing and you die a grim death, having never existed at all. Bleak. Marty isn't totally defenseless in these scenes, as he can collect a bowling ball icon, which allows him to chuck seemingly infinite balls at obstacles and aggro teens. This is actually the one thing that doesn't seem to have anything to do with the film. Marty never goes bowling. And that's one of the things that makes Back to the Future for NES so frustrating. This is clearly a game that Beam built from the ground up to tie in with the movie. Just about everything you see on screen has some basis in the film, and the events do have a sort of loopy NES logic as adaptations of a movie. It's just that they're all so bad. This is clearly not just an existing game that Beam pulled from its archives and skinned with Back to the Future visual elements, but it's also not a good original game. To be honest, I'd rather LJN have tapped some blundersome Japanese studio like, say, Advanced Communication Company to rework the bizarre Jekyll and Hyde into a Back to the Future game, because at least that would have been weird and interesting. This is just a collection of vaguely Back to the Future shaped arcade-style action events, none of which stands up on its own, and which do not add up to more than the sum of their parts. The real killer here is that LJN timed this one perfectly. It arrived mere weeks before the long-anticipated Back to the Future Part 2 hit theaters. The original 1985 film was a little old at this point as film properties to turn into video games go, but with the sequel looming in the wings, LJN had a guaranteed video game hit on their hands. And that's exactly the kind of devious market planning that turned NES owners into avowed video game haters. It's the kind of game that kids got stuck with as one of the handful of carts that they ever owned, thanks to well-meaning but ill-informed parents. And they had to replay it over and over again in a desperate hope of extracting some sort of entertainment value out of it. Why, it's enough to fill an NES chronologist with fond nostalgia for the good old days. Yes, 1987, when the NES's licensed titles were much weirder and more ambitious, and generally minted in Japan. Ah, those were the days. But I'm sad to say that, barring the invention of a real-life flux capacitor, there's no going back again. Next time on NES Works, I'm not bad, I'm just programmed that way.